The wind in the Wyoming Territory had a way of stripping things down to the bone. It scoured the paint from clapboard, worried the life from stubborn trees, and blew away any notion that a man was more than a speck of dust on a vast, unforgiving canvas. Eli Travers knew this wind. He had felt it on his face for 10 years, a constant companion since the world he knew had burned to ash and smoke. It was a lonesome sound, the sound of ghosts, and it was moaning a low, familiar tune as he rode his buckskin gelding, Gideon, toward the collection of sad-looking buildings huddled in the crease of a barren valley. The sign, hanging from one hinge, read Gray Hollow. It was a name that fit. The place looked hollowed out, as if God had carved it from the earth and then forgotten to put anything of substance inside. The few buildings were made of splintered, sun-bleached wood, leaning against each other for support like weary drunks. There was no laughter, no children playing in the single, dusty street, just the wind and a silence that felt heavier than stone. Eli was only looking for supplies: coffee, flour, a few tins of beans, and maybe a new whetstone for his knife. He had learned to read the temper of a town before he even dismounted. He could feel it in the air, a subtle pressure that told him whether to expect a friendly nod or a hand hovering near a holstered pistol. Gray Hollow felt wrong. It was a sick kind of quiet, the quiet of a trapped animal that has given up struggling. He swung down from Gideon, his joints protesting with a dull ache. The long days in the saddle were starting to carve their mark on him. He looped the reins around a hitching post outside the building marked Saloon, the only place that showed any sign of life. The batwing doors sighed open as he pushed through, bringing him into a room thick with the smell of stale beer, unwashed bodies, and something else. Something sour he could not quite name. It smelled like fear. A few men were scattered at the tables, nursing glasses of murky liquor. They looked up as he entered, their eyes flat and incurious before dismissing him and turning back to their own misery. Eli walked to the bar, his worn leather boots making a soft, rhythmic thud on the grimy floorboards. The bartender was a man whose face looked like a crumpled piece of parchment, all wrinkles and weary lines. He wiped a glass with a rag that had seen better decades. "Whiskey," Eli said, his voice a low rumble, rusty from disuse. The bartender poured a measure of amber liquid into the glass without a word. Eli slid a coin across the sticky wood. He took a sip, letting the cheap fire burn its way down his throat. He did not come here to talk, but he knew how to listen. In places like this, silence was a vessel, and sooner or later, men would pour their troubles into it. He did not have to wait long. 2 men at a corner table were speaking in low, grumbling tones, thinking the whine of the wind would cover their words. Eli, a man accustomed to listening for the snap of a twig in the dead of night, heard them clear enough. "He had her out again this morning," one of them said, a big, bearded man with hands like shovels, "preaching and praying over her like she's the devil's own daughter." The other, a scrawnier man with a nervous, darting eyes, shivered despite the stuffy air. "It ain't right, Jeb, it just ain't right. The chains, they're too heavy for a thing so small." "Reverend Cain knows what he's doing." Jeb grunted, though his voice lacked conviction. "Says he's purging the sin from her, says it's for her own soul, a public penance." "Public is one thing," the scrawny man whispered, leaning closer. "But I hear things at night, from the chapel, things a man of God shouldn't be doing to a woman he's supposed to be saving." He took a quick, shaky gulp of his drink. "They say she never confessed to nothing. He just declared her a sinner, and that was that." The preacher's chained woman. The words landed in the pit of Eli's stomach like stones. He had seen the wickedness that men could dream up, seen it in the painted faces of the raiders who had taken everything from him. He knew the many masks that cruelty wore. Piety was one of the ugliest. He finished his whiskey in one long, slow swallow, the fire in his throat doing nothing to warm the sudden chill in his blood. He set the glass down gently on the bar, gave a slight nod to the bartender, and walked back out into the wind. He stood on the porch of the saloon, letting his eyes adjust to the harsh afternoon light. Across the street, set back a little from the other buildings, was a small, unpainted chapel with a crude wooden cross nailed above the door. And there, in front of it, was the reason for the town's sickness. A man stood on a crate, his voice a booming, righteous thunder that seemed too large for his frame. He was dressed in black, a severe and imposing figure with a face that was handsome in a sharp, predatory way. His hair was dark and slicked back, and his eyes burned with a fervor that looked more like hate than love. This had to be the Reverend Thaddeus Kane. But Eli's eyes were not on him. They were on the woman standing beside the crate. She was barefoot, her feet bruised and coated in the fine, gray dust of the street. Her dress was a simple, homespun thing, torn at the shoulder and smudged with dirt. Her hair, a cascade of dark waves the color of rich soil after a rain, was unbound and tangled, catching the light in a way that seemed to defy the oppressive grayness of the town. But it was the iron that held the eye. Heavy, rusted manacles were clasped around her wrists, linked by a short length of chain that forced her to hold her hands clasped in front of her, as if in prayer. The preacher was using her as a prop in his sermon, a living symbol of sin made flesh. He gestured toward her, his voice ringing with condemnation. "Behold the wages of a wicked heart. This woman, Mara, came to us lost, mired in the filth of her own making. But here, in Grey Hollow, even the most fallen soul can be cleansed. Through penance, through submission, she will be reborn in the light." The small crowd of onlookers shifted uncomfortably. They watched with a mixture of fear and a grim, morbid fascination. No one met the woman's eyes, no one except Eli. He saw that she was not looking at the ground in shame or cowering before the preacher's holy rage. Her chin was lifted, her back was straight, a line of proud defiance against the weight of the chains and the judgment of the town. Her face was a mask of hardened indifference, but her eyes were on fire. They were a deep, stormy blue, and they were filled with a loathing so pure and so potent it was almost a physical force. As if feeling his gaze, her head turned, her eyes swept over the small crowd and locked with his. For a long, breathless moment, the world seemed to narrow to the space between them. He saw no plea for help in her gaze, no hint of surrender. He saw a soul that had been pushed to the very edge and had decided to stand its ground and fight, even if it was a fight she could not win. He saw himself, in a way. He saw the same splintered pride that had kept him walking all these years. The preacher finished his sermon with a final, booming prayer, and his men, the same rough-looking pair from the saloon, moved to lead the woman back toward the chapel. As she passed, not more than 20 feet from where Eli stood, she kept her eyes fixed on him. Her voice, when it came, was not a whisper but a low, clear statement, meant for him and him alone. "I don't want to be saved." The words were a lie. He knew it as sure as he knew his own name. He had seen the truth in the desperate flicker deep within her eyes, the part of her that had not yet been extinguished. The lie was her last piece of armor, the only thing they had not taken from her. She was daring him, challenging him, warning him away. He watched until the heavy chapel door closed behind her, shutting her away in the dark. The crowd dispersed quickly, scurrying back to their homes as if afraid the preacher's righteousness might be contagious. Eli stood alone in the street, the wind tugging at his duster. He had come for supplies. He had not come looking for a fight, but his past had taught him a bitter lesson. Sometimes, the fight finds you, and a man had to decide whether he was the kind to walk away or the kind to stand and see it through. He had walked away once, and the memory of it was a wound that never healed. Over the next 2 days, Eli moved through Grey Hollow like a ghost. He bought his supplies at the general store, speaking to the grim-faced proprietor, a man named Henderson, whose wife had died the previous winter. He learned that Henderson now paid a hefty tithe to the church to ensure his wife's soul a swift journey to heaven. He spoke to the blacksmith, a burly German named Schmidt, asking about a loose shoe on Gideon. While Schmidt worked the forge, Eli casually mentioned the chains on the woman. The blacksmith's hammer strokes faltered for just a second. "The preacher, he brings me the iron," Schmidt said, his accent thick. He would not meet Eli's eyes. "He says it is for the Lord's work. I do what I'm told. A man must feed his family." Eli learned that the Reverend Thaddeus Kane had arrived a year ago, a charismatic stranger with a Bible in one hand and a smile that could charm a snake. He had found a town beaten down by harsh winters and bad luck, and he had offered them salvation. But his salvation had a price. He uncovered a pattern of extortion and fear. A rancher whose crop failed was accused of impiety and had to sign over a portion of his land to the church. A young woman who refused the advances of one of the preacher's men was publicly shamed for wantonness. The town was caught in a web of religious terror, and Mara was the spider's prize, the ultimate symbol of his power. She was a beautiful, defiant woman with no family to protect her, the perfect victim to be twisted into a monster for all to see. On the third day, Eli sought out the preacher. He found him in a small, sparsely furnished office at the back of the chapel. Books lined one wall, but they looked untouched, mere props. The preacher sat behind a large, dark wood desk. A ledger opened before him. He looked up as Eli entered, his lips curving into a smile that did not reach his cold, calculating eyes. "Can I help you, my son?" he asked, his voice smooth as polished river stone. "I'm just a traveler," Eli said, stopping in the center of the room. He did not remove his hat. "But I saw the woman, Mara." The preacher's smile tightened. "A fallen creature. We are laboring to bring her back into the grace of God." "She doesn't look like she belongs in chains," Eli stated, his voice even. "The chains are a metaphor, my friend. They represent the bondage of sin. When her soul is free, so too will her body be." Eli reached into the pocket of his duster and pulled out a small, heavy leather pouch. He placed it on the desk. It landed with a soft, metallic clink. "I'll buy her," Eli said. The preacher's eyes flickered to the pouch and then back to Eli's face. A spark of genuine amusement lit his gaze. He leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers. "Buy her? You misunderstand. She is not a piece of property to be bought and sold." "That's exactly what she is to you," Eli replied, his tone unchanged. "Name your price." Reverend Kane chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. "You are a direct man. I can appreciate that. But you are mistaken. Mara is not for sale." He pushed the pouch back across the desk. "She belongs to God now. Her penance serves a purpose for this entire community. She is a reminder of what awaits the unrepentant." He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Her soul, my friend, is priceless." Eli looked at the man sitting behind the desk, a man who cloaked his greed and cruelty in the word of God. He saw the rot at the core of him. He picked up the pouch and slid it back into his pocket. He had known the preacher would refuse. The offer was not for him. It was a formality, a line he had to draw in the sand for himself. "Thank you for your time, Reverend," Eli said, turning to leave. "May God walk with you, stranger," the preacher called after him. Eli did not reply. He walked out of the chapel and into the fading light of dusk. He knew then what he had to do. He would not do it with gold. He would do it with silence and, if it came to it, with steel. That night, the air grew heavy and cold. Clouds rolled in from the west, blotting out the stars and smothering the moon. The wind picked up, howling through the desolate streets of Gray Hollow. A storm was coming. Eli could not rest. He found himself drawn back toward the chapel, a moth to a dying flame. He stayed in the shadows of the blacksmith's shop across the street, a silent sentinel wrapped in his duster. The chapel was dark, but a single candle flickered in a small, barred window at the side of the building. Her cell. He stood there for what felt like an eternity, listening to the rising storm, and then he heard it. It was a sound so faint he at first thought it was the wind, but it was not. It was the sound of a woman crying. It was not the loud, performative weeping of a soul seeking pity. It was a quiet, ragged, hopeless sound, the kind of sound a person makes when they believe no one in the world can hear them. It was the sound of her armor cracking. He squeezed his eyes shut. He saw the flames licking at the walls of his own small cabin. He heard the ghost of his wife's scream, the memory of his son's cry, silenced too soon. He had been too late then. He had been away, hunting, and had returned to a nightmare of ash and silence. He had sworn he would never be too late again. The crying from the chapel subsided, replaced once more by the moan of the wind. Eli did not move. He just watched. The candle flame in the window trembled, casting a weak, lonely light against the oppressive dark. He knew that Mara was in there, alone with her pain and her pride. His presence now would be an intrusion, an insult to the private grief she clutched so tightly. To help her, he had to respect the walls she had built, even as he planned to tear them down. His decision was made, not with anger, but with a cold, quiet certainty that settled deep in his bones. He would act quietly, permanently. He spent the next hour committing the area around the chapel to memory. He noted the patrol schedule of the preacher's two thugs, Jeb and Caleb. They made a round every hour, their steps lazy and confident. He saw the loose shutter on a back window, the pile of firewood that would offer cover, the way the shadows pooled and shifted with the wind. He was no longer just a drifter. He was a hunter again. Inside her small, stone-floored cell, Mara had pressed her face against the cold bars of the window. She had seen the shadow of the man across the street, the quiet one. He had been there for hours, a dark, unmoving shape. He was not like the others. The men in town looked at her with pity, or disgust, or a raw, hungry wanting that made her skin crawl. This man just looked. He looked at her as if he was seeing something more than her chains, more than her supposed sins. She did not understand him. Why offer to buy her? Men who bought women did so for one reason, but there was no hint of that in his eyes. There was only a profound and weary sadness, a stillness that seemed to absorb all the chaos around him. He had not tried to touch her, had not offered a comforting word or a false promise. His silence was more unnerving than any threat. It felt like a judgment, but not of her. It felt like he was judging the world, and had found it wanting. The first drops of rain began to fall, fat and cold, striking the dusty ground with a soft hiss. The storm was breaking. She shivered, pulling the thin blanket tighter around her shoulders. She should be afraid of him. He was a stranger, a man with a gun, and eyes that held the ghosts of 1,000 lonely miles. But as she watched his silhouette finally turn and melt back into the deeper shadows, the feeling that washed over her was not fear. It was a terrifying, unfamiliar flicker of something else, something she had not allowed herself to feel in a very, very long time. Hope. She crushed it instantly, like a man stomping on a spark in dry grass. Hope was a fool's game. Hope was what got you hurt. Hope was what got you chained in the dark. She gripped the cold iron bars, her knuckles white. She whispered the words into the rising storm, a prayer to a God she no longer believed in, a warning to the only man who had looked at her like she was still human. Don't come back. The storm broke the following night with a fury that seemed bent on tearing Grey Hollow from the earth. Rain fell in solid, wind-driven sheets, turning the street to a thick, sucking mud. Thunder cracked overhead, a sound like the world splitting apart. And for a few jagged seconds, lightning would bleach the landscape white, revealing the tortured dance of the skeletal trees on the ridge. It was the perfect sort of chaos. It was the kind of night that kept honest men indoors and gave cover to men like Eli. He moved through the deluge like a wraith, his duster heavy and slick with rain. He had left Gideon tethered in a small, sheltered copse of pine a mile out of town, packed with what few supplies he had. He carried nothing but the pistol at his hip, the knife in his boot, and a small, flat file he had acquired from the blacksmith, Schmidt, for the price of $1 and a look that asked no questions. The chapel was a block of impenetrable darkness against the storm-lit sky. As he had observed, Jeb and Caleb, the preacher's guards, had decided the Lord's work could wait out the weather. A single lamp burned in the main saloon. They would be in there, drinking away the chill. It was the kind of carelessness born from absolute certainty in their power. They never imagined anyone would dare to challenge it. Eli did not go to the front door. He circled around to the back, his boots making no sound in the soft, saturated earth. He found the loose shutter on the small window he had noted earlier. It was a simple fix for a man with a knife and patient hands. The wood groaned in protest as he pried it open, the sound swallowed by a peal of thunder. He slid through the opening, landing in a crouch inside a small storage room that smelled of damp wood and mouse droppings. The main chapel was just ahead. He moved to the door and listened. Nothing but the roar of the rain on the roof and the whistle of the wind through the eaves. He eased the door open. The air inside was cold and heavy with the scent of old incense and something else, the faint, metallic smell of blood. A row of simple wooden pews faced a stark altar. To the right of the altar was a heavy wooden door, secured by a thick iron bolt. Her cell, a sliver of candlelight shone from beneath it. He crossed the room, his every movement deliberate. He slid the file from his pocket. He was no master locksmith, but the bolt was crude, set in a heavy iron hasp. The file was enough. He set to work. The sound of metal on metal was a high, grating shriek, impossibly loud in the relative quiet of the chapel. He worked only when the thunder rolled, a long, patient process of scrape. Wait, scrape, wait. Sweat mingled with the rain on his brow, dripping into his eyes. He thought of her on the other side of the door, listening. Would she think he was one of them, coming for her in the night? Finally, with a last wrenching groan, the bolt gave way. He slid it back and pushed the door open. The cell was a stone box, no bigger than a grave. A thin, straw-filled mattress lay in one corner, and a bucket in the other. Mara was huddled on the mattress, her back against the cold stone wall. The single candle on the floor cast long, dancing shadows, making the small space seem to writhe with a life of its own. Her eyes, wide and luminous in the flickering light, were fixed on him. They held no hope, only a raw, primal fear. Her wrists were a mess of raw, chafed skin, crusted with dried blood where the heavy iron had rubbed them raw. Her ankles, he now saw, were similarly bound by a second set of chains, bolted to a ring in the floor. Her dress was torn, and a dark bruise bloomed on her cheekbone, a stark purple against her pale skin. He took a slow step into the cell, holding his empty hands out where she could see them. "I'm not going to hurt you," he said, his voice low and steady. For a moment, she just stared. Then, a sound tore from her throat, a guttural snarl of pure defiance. She launched herself at him, a whirlwind of desperation and fury. She was small, but she fought with the ferocity of a cornered wolf. Her nails raked at his face, and when he caught her wrists to stop her, she lunged forward and sank her teeth into his forearm, biting down with all her strength. Pain, sharp and hot, shot up his arm. He grunted but did not pull away. He did not strike her. He simply held her, absorbing her rage, waiting for the storm inside her to break. "Leave me!" she spat, her voice choked with a fury that was almost grief. "Get out! Just leave me be!" He looked down at her, at the fire in her eyes, the wild tangle of her hair, the way her body trembled with a mix of terror and rage. "You're not a thing to be kept," he said, his voice quiet but firm, cutting through her frantic assault. The words seemed to strike her with a physical force. The fight went out of her all at once. Her jaw went slack, and she released his arm, stumbling back until she hit the wall. She slid down to the floor, her breath coming in ragged, broken sobs. She stared at the floor, refusing to look at him. He knelt, taking the file and a small set of picks from his pocket. He started with the chains on her ankles. The lock was old and simple. It took him less than a minute. He worked with a gentle efficiency, his hands careful not to brush against her bruised skin. When the shackle fell away from her ankle, she flinched as if he had burned her. He moved to her wrists. The skin was broken, bleeding sluggishly. He had to be even more careful here. He held her hands in one of his touch so light it was barely a pressure. Her hands were ice cold. He worked the lock, his focus absolute. With a final click, the heavy manacles fell away, landing on the stone floor with a dull, final clang. She did not move. She just stared at her hands, now free, as if they belonged to someone else. She slowly flexed her fingers, a look of disbelief on her face. "Can you stand?" he asked. She looked up at him then, her eyes narrowed with suspicion. "I can walk," she insisted, her voice raw. She pushed herself up, her legs trembling violently. She swayed, her knees buckling, and he reached out, his hand hovering near her arm. But he did not touch her. She caught herself on the wall, her pride a stubborn, unbending thing. "The storm will cover us," he said, pulling his duster tighter. "We have to go, now." She gave a single, jerky nod. Together, they slipped out of the cell, leaving the chains on the floor like the shed skin of a snake. They fled the chapel, melting back into the roaring dark, the rain washing away their tracks as soon as they were made. The wilderness beyond Grey Hollow was a churning chaos of wind, rain, and impenetrable darkness. The mountains were jagged teeth against the sky, their slopes a treacherous mix of slick rock and grasping thorns. Eli led the way, relying on instinct and the faint memory of the land he had studied. He held Mara's hand, not for comfort, but to keep them from being separated in the maelstrom. Her hand was small in his, her grip surprisingly strong, a silent point of contact in the roaring world. They moved for hours, a desperate, stumbling flight. The cold seeped into their bones, and the mud pulled at their feet, trying to drag them down. Mara did not complain. She did not speak at all. She just followed, her breath a harsh gasp in the night, her determination a palpable force. As the first hint of a watery, gray dawn threatened the eastern horizon, they came to a river. It was not wide, but the storm had turned it into a raging, brown torrent, thick with debris. It clawed at its banks, its roar a constant, hungry threat. "We have to cross," Eli said, his voice barely audible over the sound of the water. "Their tracks will end here." He pointed to a spot where a large, fallen log offered a precarious bridge. He went first, testing its stability. It was slick with rain and moss, but it held. He turned and held out a hand to her. She looked from his hand to the raging water and then back to his face. The suspicion was there again, a dark and familiar shadow in her eyes. She shook her head. "I can do it," she said, and before he could argue, she pushed past him and started across the log. She was halfway across when her bare foot slipped on a patch of wet moss. She cried out, a sharp gasp of surprise and fear, as her legs went out from under her. She fell, hitting the water with a heavy splash that was instantly swallowed by the river's roar. The current seized her immediately, pulling her under, tumbling her like a broken doll. Eli did not hesitate. He plunged into the freezing water after her, the shock of the cold a violent blow to his chest. He fought the powerful current, his eyes scanning the churning surface. He saw a flash of her dark hair and lunged, his fingers catching in the fabric of her dress. He got a firm grip and pulled, fighting with every ounce of his strength to drag them both toward the opposite bank. He hauled her onto the muddy shore, his lungs burning, his limbs numb with cold. She was coughing, spitting up water, her body racked with violent shivers. He dragged her further from the river's edge, into the relative shelter of a thick stand of fir trees. She was soaked to the bone, her skin a deathly pale. Hypothermia was a swift and silent killer in these mountains. He worked quickly, his movements economical despite his own exhaustion. He gathered dry tinder from the underside of fallen logs, shielding it with his body as he struck a match. The flame sputtered, then caught. He carefully nurtured it, adding larger and larger pieces of wood until a small, defiant fire was blazing against the cold, wet gloom. He stripped off his own heavy wool coat, the outer layer soaked but the inside still mostly dry. He draped it over her shoulders. She was shivering too hard to resist, her teeth chattering uncontrollably. She huddled by the fire, her arms wrapped around herself, her eyes wide and staring into the flames. He sat on the other side of the fire, watching her. He said nothing. He just fed the flames, the silence between them broken only by the crackle of the wood and the distant roar of the river. After a long time, her shivering began to subside. The color started to return to her cheeks. She finally looked at him, her gaze sharp and accusatory. "Why?" she demanded, her voice a harsh croak. "Why are you doing this?" "You would have frozen," he replied simply. "No, not just that," she shot back, her voice gaining strength. "All of it. Breaking me out, dragging me through the mountains. What do you want from me? Did you think I would be grateful, that I would fall at your feet and thank you for being my hero?" Her words were stones, hurled across the fire. "You just wanted to feel like a man, didn't you? Saving the poor, helpless woman. It makes you feel strong. It makes you feel righteous." He listened to her tirade without expression. He poked at the fire with a stick, sending a shower of sparks into the damp air. When she was finished, the silence stretched again. He finally looked up, his gray eyes meeting hers. They held no anger, only a deep and profound weariness. "I've never been anyone's hero," he said. The words were quiet, a simple statement of fact, and in their stark finality, they disarmed her completely. She had expected him to argue, to defend himself. She did not know what to do with his quiet, unadorned truth. Suspicion warred with exhaustion on her face. She held his gaze for a long moment, searching for the lie, for the hidden angle. She found none. All she saw was a man as broken as she was, a man haunted by ghosts of his own. The fight drained out of her, replaced by a weariness so profound it was a physical weight. She pulled his coat tighter around her. The scent of him, rain, wood smoke, and leather, a strange and unwelcome comfort. Without another word, she lay down on the damp earth, as close to the fire as she dared, and closed her eyes. Sleep did not come easily. It was a shallow, restless state, filled with shadows and whispers from a past she could never outrun. She remembered her uncle's rough hands on her shoulder, his beery breath on her face as he sold her to a passing trapper for the price of a new rifle. "She's got a strong back, and she don't talk much," he had said, as if trading livestock. She remembered the trapper's silent, leering appraisal. She had been 15. She remembered James. He had found her 2 years later, after she had run from the trapper. James, with his easy smile and promises of a new life in California. He had been kind. He had bought her a new dress and told her she was beautiful. He had made her believe, for a few sweet, foolish months, that she could be something other than a piece of property. Then he had played a bad hand of cards in a dusty saloon and used her to settle his debt, trading her to the saloon owner. As he left her there, he had avoided her eyes, muttering, "It's just for a little while. Mara, I'll win you back." He never came back. That was the betrayal that had scarred the deepest, that had taught her that kindness was just another tool men used to get what they wanted. And finally, she remembered the preacher. Reverend Cain had come through town, his voice all fire and brimstone, the The saloon owner, eager to be seen as a righteous man, had donated her to the preacher's cause, a fallen woman to be redeemed. Cain had looked at her, his eyes stripping her bare, and declared her a vessel of sin. There had been no trial, no confession, just his word. And in Gray Hollow, his word was law. Across the fire, Eli watched her sleep. Her face, in repose, lost some of its hardness. He could see the ghost of the woman she might have been. He saw the flicker of her eyelids, the slight frown that creased her brow, and he knew she was not at peace. Watching her, so vulnerable in the firelight, stirred the ashes of his own nightmare. He saw the fire again. Not this small, life-giving flame, but the raging inferno that had consumed his world, the smell of burning pine and something else, something terrible. He saw the silhouettes of the raiders, their faces painted in grotesque masks, their laughter a sound from hell itself. He heard his wife, Sarah, scream his name. He heard the cry of his 4-year-old son, Samuel, a thin, terrified wail that had been cut short with an awful finality. He had been too late. He had come home to a smoking ruin and a silence that screamed louder than any sound. "I've never been anyone's hero." It was the truest thing he had ever said. He had not been a hero to the two people who had mattered most. The rain softened to a drizzle, and the gray light of morning filtered through the trees. The world was quiet now, washed clean. He must have dozed off, his head resting on his knees. A small sound brought him back. He opened his eyes. Mara was still asleep, but in her sleep, she had moved. Her arm was outstretched, her fingers hovering just an inch from his hand, which rested on the ground beside him. As he watched, her fingers moved closer, slowly, hesitantly, and then touched the back of his hand. Her touch was as light as a falling leaf, a simple, questing gesture. It was as if, even in her dreams, some part of her needed to know if he was real, if this strange, quiet man who had asked for nothing, who had taken nothing, who had simply undone her chains, was not just another ghost born of the storm. The mountains did not care if they lived or died. They were an ancient, stone-hearted wilderness of sharp peaks and shadowed valleys, where the wind was a constant predator, and the silence was broken only by the cry of a hawk or the distant howl of a wolf. For 3 days, Eli and Mara moved through this brutal landscape, ghosts haunted by the memory of Gray Hollow. The journey was a slow and painful grinding down of the body and the will. The cold was a physical thing, a presence that seeped through their wet clothes and settled deep in their bones. They had barely any food, a handful of dried jerky and a few hard biscuits from Eli's saddlebags. Hunger became a dull, constant ache in their bellies. The terrain was a relentless enemy. They climbed steep, scree-covered slopes that tore at their hands and scrambled down into ravines choked with thorny undergrowth. At night, they huddled together for warmth beside a small, smoky fire, the vast, star-dusted darkness pressing in on all sides, filled with the rustles and snaps of unseen animals. Mara was a study in grim determination. She refused to show weakness, refused to rely on him any more than she absolutely had to. Her bare feet were a testament to her suffering. They were cut, bruised, and swollen, leaving small, bloody prints on the cold stones. Yet she never once complained. She wrapped them in strips of cloth torn from the hem of her dress and kept walking, her back straight, her jaw set. She was trying to prove something to him, and to herself, that she was not a damsel to be rescued, but a survivor. But the river had taken more from her than just her pride. The icy water had left a chill in her that the fire could not seem to touch. By the 4th day, a fever had taken root. Her skin was hot and dry to the touch, and a faint, unhealthy flush colored her cheeks. Her steps began to falter. She stumbled more often, her movements becoming clumsy and uncoordinated. She tried to hide it, gritting her teeth and pushing onward. But the fever was a relentless thief, stealing her strength. Late in the afternoon, as they were navigating a treacherous ridge, her legs finally gave out. She collapsed in a heap of worn fabric and exhaustion, too weak even to curse. Eli was beside her in an instant. He knelt and placed a hand on her forehead. She flinched from his touch but was too tired to pull away. Her skin burned. "You need to rest," he said, his voice low. "I'm fine," she rasped, trying to push herself up. Her arms trembled, and she fell back. "Just need a minute." He looked around at the unforgiving landscape. There was no shelter here, only wind and rock. He looked down at her, at the fierce, stubborn pride still blazing in her fever-bright eyes. He knew she would rather die on this mountain than admit she needed him. Without a word, he gently slid his arms beneath her, one under her knees and the other behind her back, and lifted her. She was shockingly light, a fragile bundle of bones and fire. "No," she protested, her voice weak. "Put me down. I can walk." She beat a fist feebly against his chest, a gesture that held no strength. "Later," he said, and started walking. He carried her for what felt like miles. His own body ached with fatigue, his muscles screaming in protest, but he did not stop. She was a feverish weight in his arms, her head eventually coming to rest against his shoulder. At some point, her protests quieted, and she fell into a restless, muttering sleep. He walked on, his face set in a grim mask, his eyes scanning the horizon for any sign of hope. He found it just as the sun was beginning to bleed its last light across the western peaks. Tucked into a small, sheltered bowl on the mountainside was a structure, barely visible against the gray rock, an abandoned trapper's cabin. It was a skeleton picked clean by time and weather, its roof sagging, its single window a dark, vacant eye. But it was 4 walls and a chance. He pushed open the groaning door with his shoulder and carried her inside. The cabin was one small room, empty save for a stone hearth, a broken table, and the lingering scent of wood smoke and solitude. He gently laid Mara down on the floor, on top of his own bedroll, and covered her with his duster. She fought the vulnerability of it all. As he nursed her over the next few days, she fought him with the only weapons she had left, sarcasm and a biting wit. He brewed a thin broth from a rabbit he managed to snare, and she eyed it with suspicion. "You aim to poison me with that?" she asked, her voice still rough. He ignored the jibe and helped her sit up, holding the warm tin cup to her lips. She drank, her pride warring with the desperate need of her body. He was a quiet, relentless caregiver. He cleaned and bandaged her feet with fresh cloth. He kept the fire going, the small room filled with a steady, comforting warmth. He sat with her through the long nights of her fever, placing cool, damp cloths on her forehead when she cried out in her delirium. Through it all, he rarely spoke, his presence a calm, unshakable constant in the fever-tossed sea of her consciousness. Slowly, her walls began to crack. The fever broke, leaving her weak but clear-headed. She would watch him as he moved about the small cabin, his movements efficient and purposeful. She saw the way he could mend a broken chair leg with a bit of twine and a sharp knife, the way he could coax a flame from damp wood. There was a competence to him, a quiet strength that had nothing to do with cruelty or power. One afternoon, he sat by the fire with a piece of old leather he had found in his saddlebags and the sole of a worn-out boot. He worked for hours with his knife and an awl, his hands steady and sure. When he was finished, he had fashioned a pair of crude but serviceable shoes. They were simple, soft-soled moccasins, stitched together with rawhide. He wordlessly handed them to her. She took them, turning them over in her hands. They were ugly, misshapen things. "They look like something a badger would wear," she said, her lip curling in a faint smirk. He just nodded, turning his attention back to the fire. She looked from his impassive face to the clumsy shoes in her hands. No one had ever made anything for her before, not something given freely. without expectation of payment. She hesitated, then slowly, carefully, slipped them on. They were soft against her ravaged feet. She kept wearing them. The buried parts of her began to surface, a dry sense of humor, a sharp intelligence, a softness she kept hidden beneath layers of hardened pride. She was still cautious, still wary, but the raw hostility had begun to melt away, replaced by a grudging curiosity. One night, as they sat on opposite sides of the hearth, the firelight dancing on their faces, she finally asked the question that had been tormenting her. Why? He looked up from the arrow he was fletching. Why what? Why me? She clarified, her voice barely a whisper. Why help me, a woman like me? He set his work down, his gaze distant, looking at something far beyond the walls of the cabin. He looked at the ghosts in the fire. Because no one helped the ones I loved, he said. The words were simple, heavy, and stripped bare of any self-pity. They landed in the quiet space between them with the weight of a tombstone. In that moment, she understood. She saw the profound and bottomless grief he carried, a loss so great it had hollowed him out, leaving only this quiet purpose. He was not saving her to be a hero. He was saving her because he had failed to save someone else. Their wounds were different, but they came from the same cruel world. A warmth spread through her chest, a dangerous, unfamiliar warmth that had nothing to do with the fire. It was a feeling she had not allowed herself since James, a feeling she had sworn off forever. She began to watch him differently. She watched the way his hands, so gentle when tending to her wounds, could be so strong when he chopped wood for the fire. She watched him patch the sagging roof, his movements economical and sure. He would hunt and cook and clean, all without a word, all without asking for a single thing in return. He treated her not as a burden, not as a prize, but as an equal. He gave her space to heal, both in body and in spirit. The feeling grew, this treacherous warmth. It was a terrifying vulnerability. To feel this way was to give him a weapon he could use to hurt her. But as she watched him, day after day, she began to suspect he would never use it. One night, she lay on her bedroll, watching him as he slept by the door, a silent guardian. The moonlight slanted through the dirty window pane, casting a silver glow on his face. It softened the harsh lines carved by grief and hardship. In sleep, he looked younger, almost peaceful. The warmth in her chest bloomed into an unbearable ache. She rose, her new shoes making no sound on the rough floorboards. She knelt beside him, her heart hammering against her ribs. She was acting on an impulse she did not understand, a need that was stronger than her fear. She leaned down, her hair brushing against his cheek, and gently, hesitantly, pressed her lips to his. It was a soft, fleeting kiss, as light as a moth's wing. He did not stir. She pulled back quickly, her breath catching in her throat, and retreated to her bedroll, her mind reeling. She lay awake for the rest of the night, convinced she had made a terrible mistake. He did not mention it the next morning. He went about his chores as usual, his calm silence an unnerving mystery. The tension in the small cabin became a palpable thing. Mara was convinced he was mocking her, or worse, pitying her. By midday, she could stand it no longer. He was outside, splitting firewood. She watched him for a moment, then walked out to confront him. "Why haven't you said anything?" she demanded. He stopped, resting the axe on the chopping block. He turned to face her, his expression unreadable. "About what?" "You know what," she snapped, her face flushing. "Last night." He held her gaze, his own eyes clouded with something she could not decipher. He said, very gently, "You don't owe me that." The word struck her like a slap. Owe him? She had offered him the first genuine, freely chosen piece of herself in years, and he thought it was payment? He thought she was a debt to be settled? All her fear and vulnerability curdled into a hot, bitter rage. "Owe you," she repeated, her voice shaking. "You think that's what that was? You think I'm some broken thing you've patched up? And now I'm paying my debts with the only coin you think I have?" "No," he said, taking a step toward her. "That's not what I meant." "Isn't it?" she accused, her voice rising. "You look at me and you see a victim, a poor broken creature you had to save. You don't see me at all." He stopped, his face etched with a sudden, raw emotion. He reached out, not to touch her, but as if to hold back her words. "You're wrong," he said, his voice low and intense. "I see you, and you're not broken." He took another step, closing the distance between them. He looked directly into her eyes, his own gaze burning with a fierce light. "You're not broken," he repeated, his voice dropping to a raw whisper. "You're burning." The anger in her collapsed, extinguished by the shocking, profound truth of his words. He did not see her as a fragile, damaged thing. He saw the fire inside her, the rage and the grief and the stubborn will to survive, and he was not afraid of it. He was not trying to put it out. He was watching it burn. In that moment, the last of her walls crumbled to dust. He slowly raised his hand and cupped her cheek, his thumb gently stroking her skin. His touch was not a claim of ownership, but a question. She leaned into his hand, a silent answer, and closed her eyes. That night, they came together. There was no desperate passion, no frantic claiming. It was slow, hesitant, a quiet exploration. It was a conversation spoken in touch and breath and shared warmth. For Eli, it was the first time he had held a woman since Sarah, a thawing of a heart he thought long frozen. For Mara, it was something entirely new. It was the first time she had been with a man where she was not property, not a payment, not a victim. It was the first time she had ever been a choice. Afterward, she lay in his arms, her head on his chest, listening to the steady, rhythmic beat of his heart. A strange, unfamiliar wetness trickled down her cheek. She was crying. She brought a hand to her face, surprised by the tears. They were not tears of pain, or of grief, or of shame. They fell silently, in the warm, safe dark of the cabin. She was crying because, for the first time in a lifetime of running and fighting and surviving, she finally felt safe. For a week, the small trapper's cabin was a world unto itself. It was a fragile pocket of peace carved out of the wilderness, a sanctuary held together by shared warmth and unspoken understanding. The brutal journey that had brought them there faded into a dull memory, replaced by the simple rhythms of survival. They spoke little, but their silence was no longer a space of suspicion, but one of comfortable companionship. They learned the landscape of each other's moods, the way a slight frown on his face meant he was thinking of the past, the way a quick, wry smile from her was a victory against the shadows. In the quiet moments, they would find their eyes meeting across the small room, a slow dawning of recognition in their gazes. It was a hesitant, careful thing, this peace, as delicate as a spider's web in the morning dew. It was shattered on a cold, clear morning. The air was crisp with the promise of autumn, and a pale sun slanted through the trees. Mara was outside, gathering firewood, a task she now performed with a fluid strength that had returned to her limbs. Eli was inside, cleaning his rifle. A quiet domesticity had settled over them, so foreign and so precious that it felt like a dream. The first sign of trouble was a sound that did not belong, the sharp, unnatural snap of a dry twig under a heavy boot. It was followed by the low nicker of a horse. Eli was on his feet in an instant, his movement silent and fluid. He was at the door, his rifle in his hand, his face a hard, unreadable mask. He met Mara's eyes as she stood frozen by the woodpile. He saw the flicker of fear in her gaze, the same fear he felt as a cold knot in his own gut. He motioned with his head for her to get inside. She did, moving quickly and quietly, her brief dream of peace dissolving like smoke. He peered through a crack in the door. 3 men on horseback were picking their way down the slope toward the cabin. They were not drifters or hunters. They had the hard, predatory look of men who were paid to find things. Bounty hunters, one of them. A big man with a greasy beard and a cruel slash of a mouth pointed toward the thin wisp of smoke rising from their chimney. "They're here," Eli said, his voice a low whisper. 3 of them. Mara's face went pale. She looked from the door to Eli, her expression crumbling from fear into a raw, painful guilt. "He sent them," she breathed, her voice choked. "Cain sent them for me." She wrapped her arms around herself, a familiar gesture of self-protection. "This is my fault. They're here because of you helping me." She looked around the small cabin, her eyes wild and trapped. Her old instinct, the one that had kept her alive for so long, screamed at her. "Run!" "I have to go," she said, her voice trembling. "I can draw them off. You can slip away while they follow me." She was already moving toward the back wall, toward the single, small window. To her, it was a simple, brutal calculation. Her life for his. He was a good man, a man who deserved to live. She was a stray, a piece of trouble that would only ever bring pain to those who got too close. He crossed the room in 2 long strides and caught her arm. His grip was firm but not rough. "No," he said, his voice leaving no room for argument. "You don't understand," she insisted, trying to pull away. "They'll kill you for being with me. Let me go. Eli, please." It was the first time she had used his name, and it came out as a desperate plea. He turned her to face him, his hands on her shoulders. He looked down into her frantic eyes, and his own were steady as stone. "I am not letting you go again," he said. The words were a vow. He was not just refusing to let her run into the wilderness. He was refusing to let her run from him, from the fragile thing they had started to build. "We fight them, together." There was no time to argue. The sound of hoofbeats grew louder, stopping just outside the cabin. "Ho! The cabin!" a rough voice called out. It was the bearded man. "We know you're in there. We got a warrant for the woman, Mara, signed by the righteous Reverend Cain of Grey Hollow. Send her out, and the man with her can walk away clean." Eli moved to the side of the door, pressing his back against the rough-hewn logs. He looked at Mara. Her fear was still there, but something else was dawning in her eyes, a flicker of the same fire he had seen in Grey Hollow. He had said they would fight together. No one had ever said that to her before. She gave him a single, sharp nod, and picked up the heavy iron poker from the hearth, her knuckles white around the handle. "She's not here," Eli called back, his voice calm and even. "You've got the wrong place." A coarse laugh came from outside. "Don't play us for fools. We tracked you all the way from the river. Last chance. Send her out." Eli knew there would be no more words. He raised his rifle, its barrel pointed at the heavy plank door. He waited. The silence outside stretched, taut and thin. Then came the splintering crash of a boot hitting the door. The wood shuddered but held. Another crash, and the lock splintered. The door flew open, and the bearded man stood framed in the doorway, a pistol in his hand, a triumphant sneer on his face. Eli fired. The rifle's report was a deafening explosion in the small space. The big man grunted, a look of pure surprise on his face, and stumbled backward, clutching a dark, spreading stain on his chest. The other 2 opened fire, their bullets tearing through the open doorway, thudding into the walls of the cabin. Eli had already dropped to the floor, rolling behind the flimsy cover of the broken table. Mara was crouched by the hearth, the poker held like a weapon. One of the men, a skinny whelp with a pockmarked face, tried to rush in, firing wildly. As he crossed the threshold, Eli fired again from the floor. The man yelped and went down, clutching his leg. The third man was smarter. He stayed outside, using the corner of the cabin for cover, sending a steady rain of bullets toward the doorway. Eli was pinned down. He knew he could not stay there. He looked at Mara, their eyes meeting in a flash of understanding. He pointed with his rifle toward the back window. She nodded. He laid down covering fire, sending 2 quick shots toward the corner where the last man was hiding. In that moment of distraction, Mara scrambled to the back of the cabin. She used the poker to smash the remaining glass from the window frame and hauled herself through the opening. The man outside heard the sound and cursed. He was caught between 2 targets. He made his choice and ran toward the back of the cabin, trying to cut Mara off. It was the mistake Eli had been waiting for. Eli surged to his feet and out the front door. The bounty hunter had his back to him, his pistol raised, tracking Mara as she scrambled into the trees. "Turn around," Eli said, his voice as cold as a grave. The man spun, his eyes wide with panic. He tried to bring his pistol to bear, but he was too slow. Eli's final shot was clean and final. The man dropped his gun and fell into the dirt. Silence descended, broken only by the ringing in Eli's ears and the frantic pounding of his own heart. He looked around. The bearded man was dead. The one he had shot in the leg was groaning, trying to crawl away. The third lay still. "Mara?" he called out, his voice rough. She appeared from the edge of the trees, her face pale, her eyes wide. She was unharmed. A wave of relief, so powerful it almost buckled his knees, washed over him. He took a step toward her, and then a sharp, searing pain exploded in his side. He looked down. A dark red stain was spreading across his shirt, just above his hip. In the chaos of the final exchange, the third man's last shot had found its mark. He grunted, pressing a hand to the wound. The world tilted, the edges of his vision turning gray. He stumbled, his legs refusing to hold him. "Eli!" Mara's voice was a sharp cry of alarm. She was at his side in an instant, her arm around his waist, helping him back into the cabin. He collapsed onto his bedroll, the pain a hot, persistent fire. Mara knelt beside him, her hands trembling as she gently pulled his torn and bloodied shirt away from the wound. It was a deep, ugly gash, bleeding freely. For a moment, she just stared, her face a mask of horror. He saw the panic rising in her eyes. Then, she seemed to take hold of herself. The fear was still there, but she forced it down, her expression hardening with a fierce resolve. She was no longer a victim. She was a survivor. And now, she was a protector. "Don't you die on me, Eli Travers," she whispered, her voice shaking but firm. She worked with a frantic, focused energy. She tore strips from her own dress, the one he had given his coat to protect. She cleaned the wound with whiskey from his flask, ignoring his sharp intake of breath. She found his small sewing kit, the one he used for mending leather, and threaded the strongest needle with a piece of gut leader. Her hands trembled so badly she could barely hold the needle steady, but she took a deep, shuddering breath and began to sew his skin back together. She did not cry. She bit her lip until it bled, her face pale and streaked with dirt and grime. But she did not shed a single tear. She worked with a grim determination, her stitches clumsy but tight. When she was finished, she bandaged the wound tightly with the cleanest cloth she could find. He had drifted into a gray haze of pain, but he was aware of her presence, her surprisingly gentle touch, her whispered words of encouragement that seemed directed as much at herself as at him. He was weak for days, drifting in and out of a feverish sleep. She never left his side. She hunted for them, her skills with his snares surprisingly adept. She brought him water and broth. She kept the fire lit. She protected him, in his moments of clarity. He would watch her, and he would see a strength in her he had only glimpsed before. The fire he had seen was now a steady, burning flame. As he began to recover, a new resolve settled in her. She had spent her life running, being passed from one captor to another. She had thought freedom was a place you could run to, but as she sat in that small cabin, watching the steady rise and fall of Eli's chest, she realized freedom was not a place. It was something you had to claim. Running was just another kind of chain. One evening, as he was sitting up and able to take solid food. She spoke. "I'm going back," she said, her voice quiet but unshakable. He looked at her, his expression serious. "Back where?" "To Grey Hollow," she said. "I'm not going to let him chase me for the rest of my life. I'm not going to be the reason men like that come after you. I'm going to face him. On my terms." He knew he could not talk her out of it. He saw the iron will in her eyes. It was the same will that had kept her alive in Cain's cell. "Then I'm going with you," he said. It was not a question. "You're not well enough," she argued. "Your side." "It will hold," he said, his voice firm. "You think I'd let you go back there alone? After everything?" He reached out and took her hand. "We started this together. We'll finish it together, even if it means dying beside you." They left 2 days later, riding Gideon slowly and carefully. Eli was still weak, his side a constant, throbbing ache, but he sat tall in the saddle. They rode under the cold light of a waning moon, the silvered landscape stretching out before them like a map to a reckoning. The journey was slow. Eli knew of a place they could rest, a small ranch owned by a widow he had helped a few years back, a woman named Martha Stewart. Her ranch was a day's ride from Grey Hollow, a good place to gather their strength before the final confrontation. They arrived at the ranch at dusk. It was a neat, well-kept place, a testament to the woman's resilience. Martha was a stern, weather-beaten woman in her 50s, with graying hair pulled back in a tight bun and eyes that missed nothing. She greeted Eli with a rare, small smile of recognition. "Eli Travers," she said, her voice raspy from the wind. "Thought a wolf might have gotten you by now." She looked at his pale face and the way he held himself stiffly. "You look like hell." Her gaze shifted to Mara, who sat quietly on the horse behind him. The smile vanished from Martha's face. Her eyes narrowed, taking in Mara's worn dress, her travel-stained appearance, the defiant set of her jaw. It was a look Mara knew well. It was a look of instant, unvarnished judgment. Martha gave them sanctuary. She gave Eli a clean bed and dressed his wound with a poultice of herbs that smelled of the earth. She gave them both a hot meal of stew and fresh bread, the first real food they had eaten in weeks. But she watched Mara with a constant, simmering suspicion. She spoke only to Eli, her questions about where he had been and what trouble he had found polite but probing. She treated Mara as if she were a shadow, an unwelcome presence at her table. Later that night, Mara was in the small room Martha had given her, trying to wash the grime from her face in a basin of cold water. The wall was thin. She could hear their voices from the main room, Eli's, low and tired, and Martha's, sharp with concern. "You need to be careful, Eli," Martha was saying. "A man like you. A good man. You can't afford to be careless with your name." "She's a good woman, Martha," Eli replied, his voice strained. "She's just been through a lot." Martha snorted, a sound of disbelief. "I can see what she's been through. I've seen her kind before. They latch onto a decent man and drag him down into the mud with them. She's got trouble written all over her. Don't you throw your life away on a girl like her." A girl like her. The words were a physical blow. Mara stood perfectly still, the wet cloth dripping from her hand. It was the story of her life. She was not a person. She was a kind of girl, a fallen woman, a piece of property, a sinner, trouble. No matter how far she ran, she could never outrun what people saw when they looked at her. And now, she was a stain on Eli, the one man who had looked at her and seen something else. Her decision was instant and absolute. She would not be the anchor that dragged him down. She would not let this good woman's prediction come true. She quietly packed the few things she had, the ugly shoes he had made her, a small piece of bread from dinner. She would leave in the dead of night. He would be safe here. He would heal, and he would be free of her. She waited until the house was dark and silent. She eased her door open and crept through the main room. A floorboard creaked under her foot, a sound as loud as a gunshot in the stillness. Leaving so soon?" His voice came from the shadows by the hearth. He was sitting in a chair, a blanket around his shoulders, waiting for her. He had known she would try to run. She stopped, her back to him. "I heard what she said," Mara whispered, her voice thick. "She's right. I'll only bring you trouble." "I've had trouble my whole life," he said, his voice a low rumble in the dark. "It's nothing new." "This is different," she insisted, turning to face him. Her face was a pale oval in the moonlight slanting through the window. "I won't be the reason you get thrown away." He stood up, wincing as he put weight on his side, and walked slowly toward her until he was standing right in front of her. He looked down at her, his face serious, his eyes searching hers. "For 10 years, he said, his voice raw with a pain that had nothing to do with his wound. "I've been wandering, no purpose, no reason to stop in one place more than another. Just moving. There was nothing to stay for." He reached out and gently brushed a stray lock of hair from her face, his fingers lingering on her cheek. "You," he said, his voice cracking with an emotion he could no longer contain. "You're the only one who makes me feel like there's something worth staying for." The tears she had refused to shed finally came. They welled up in her eyes and traced silent paths down her cheeks. He did not wipe them away. He just stood there with her, a silent witness to the breaking of the dam. They arrived at the outskirts of Gray Hollow on a Sunday morning. The sky was a hard, brilliant blue, and a cold wind swept down from the mountains, carrying the sound of a single tolling church bell. It was a sound of summons, a call to judgment. They rode down the main street. The town was quiet. The few people they saw hurrying toward the chapel, their faces pinched and pious. They stared as Eli and Mara passed, their eyes wide with shock and fear. The chained woman had returned, and the stranger was with her. The preacher's voice was already booming from within the chapel, a righteous thunder spilling out into the cold morning air. He was giving a fiery sermon about sin and repentance, about the devil who walks in sheep's clothing, about the wickedness that must be purged with an iron hand. Eli swung down from Gideon's back, then reached up to help Mara down. He stood before her, his hands on her waist. He looked into her eyes, a silent question. Her face was pale, but her gaze was steady. The fear was there, but beneath it was a core of pure, unbending steel. She was ready. He took her hand, his fingers lacing through hers. Their grip was firm, a silent promise. Together, they turned and walked toward the sound of the preacher's voice. They walked up the steps of the chapel, the townsfolk scattering before them like frightened birds. Eli pushed the heavy doors open. The preacher stood at his pulpit, his arms raised to the heavens. The pews were filled with the fearful, silent faces of Gray Hollow. Every head turned as the doors swung open, letting the bright, cold sunlight spill into the dim, incense-heavy air. Eli walked straight down the center aisle, with Mara by his side, their clasped hands a symbol of defiance. They did not stop until they stood directly before the pulpit, looking up at the man who had played God with their lives. The preacher's voice faltered, his sermon dying in his throat. His face, for a single, fleeting moment, was a mask of pure, unadulterated shock. Then it hardened into a familiar mask of righteous fury. The final battle had begun. The world inside the chapel narrowed to the space between the pulpit and the door. For a long, silent moment, the only sound was the collective, indrawn breath of the congregation and the low moan of the wind outside. Reverend Thaddeus Kane stood frozen, his hand still raised in a gesture of benediction that now looked like a curse. His face, a mask of pious benevolence just seconds before, contorted into a snarl of pure, venomous hatred. His shock gave way to a towering, theatrical rage. He pointed a trembling finger at Mara, his voice a booming, accusatory thunder that shook the rafters. "Behold, the harlot returns, not content with fleeing the Lord's righteous judgment. She comes back, leading her demon lover in her wake, to defile this holy place." He turned his burning gaze on Eli. "And this man, this is no savior. This is the devil's own tool, sent from the pits of hell to tempt the faithful and undo the Lord's work. He comes with a whisper and a promise, a serpent in this garden, to seduce the weak-willed and lead them into damnation. She has bewitched him, this witch of the wilderness, ensnared him with her sinful flesh." A low, uneasy murmur rippled through the pews. The townsfolk were a captive audience, caught between the preacher's familiar, terrifying authority and the stark, silent defiance of the two figures standing in the aisle. Some faces, those of Cain's most devout followers, hardened with judgment, their eyes turning on Mara with renewed suspicion. But others, many others, looked uncertain. They looked at Mara's face, pale and determined, but no longer bowed in shame. They looked at Eli, his hand clasped in hers, a quiet protector, not a demon. They looked at the blacksmith, Schmidt, whose face was a thundercloud of doubt, and at the store owner, Henderson, who clutched his young daughter's hand, his expression deeply troubled. The seeds of doubt that Eli had sown were beginning to sprout in the poisoned soil of Grey Hollow. "She does not belong to you, Cain," Eli said, his voice quiet but carrying with a cold, clear authority that cut through the preacher's blustering. "Her soul is her own." "Her soul is black with sin," Cain roared. "And you are a party to her wickedness. You will both burn for this blasphemy." "The only blasphemy in this town is yours," Eli continued, taking a step forward. He reached into his duster and pulled out not a weapon, but a small, leather-bound ledger. He held it up for all to see. "I have here your book of tithes, the one you keep hidden beneath the floorboards of your office, the one that shows the donations you extorted from the grieving and the desperate." He looked toward Henderson. "Is it true, Mr. Henderson, that you signed over a portion of your store's profits to ensure your late wife's passage to heaven?" Henderson paled, but after a moment's hesitation, he gave a stiff, jerky nod. A gasp went through the crowd. "And you, Mr. Schmidt," Eli said, turning his gaze to the blacksmith. "Did the Reverend not threaten to declare your contract with the railroad null, claiming it was work done in avarice, unless a tenth of the payment went to his church for purification?" Schmidt's big hands clenched into fists. He stared at the preacher, his face flushing with a slow, building rage, and nodded curtly. Cain's face had gone from red to a waxy, mottled white. "Lies! These are the twisted lies of the devil, spoken to poison your hearts against me." "Then perhaps you can explain this," Eli said, pulling another set of papers from his coat. "These are testimonies, one from a widow in the next county, whose ranch you tried to seize after her husband died, another from a young man you had beaten and driven out of town because he dared to question your authority." Eli's voice was relentless, each word a hammer blow against the preacher's crumbling facade. "And this is a confession." He held up the last piece of paper. "It is from the man I shot, the bounty hunter you sent after us. He was more than willing to talk in exchange for a doctor and a promise of leniency from a federal court." He tells a very interesting story. A story about a man named Thaddeus Cain, who is no reverend at all, but a con man and a thief, wanted for fraud in Missouri and extortion in the Nebraska territory. A man who uses God as a shield for his own greed. The crowd was on its feet now, the murmurs swelling into a low roar of confusion and anger. Cain's authority was dissolving before their eyes, his power revealed as nothing more than a well-crafted illusion. He looked around wildly, his eyes darting from face to face, seeing not adoration but doubt and accusation. He was losing them. He was losing everything. In his panic, he did the one thing that would seal his fate. His eyes locked on Mara, the source of his undoing. With a strangled cry of pure rage, he lunged from the pulpit, his hands outstretched like claws, intending to grab her, to make her his symbol of power one last time. "The witch is mine!" he screamed. Eli moved in a blur. He pushed Mara behind him, and in the same fluid motion, his pistol was in his hand, the barrel leveled at the preacher's chest. The click of the hammer being cocked was a small, sharp sound that was louder than all the shouting. Instant silence fell over the chapel. The air crackled with tension. Cain froze, his hands still reaching, his face a mask of disbelief. At the back of the church, two men, his last remaining loyal enforcers, drew their own weapons.
"This is a house of God,"
Cain spat, his voice a venomous whisper. "Then you should know better than to defile it," Eli replied, his voice deadly calm. The standoff lasted for a heartbeat, an eternity. Then, one of the enforcers at the back made a fatal miscalculation. He raised his pistol, aiming for Eli. The world erupted in chaos. Eli fired first, not at Cain, but at the man who was the most immediate threat. The enforcer cried out and stumbled back through the chapel doors. The second man opened fire, and the small church became a maelstrom of noise and violence. Gunpowder smoke filled the air, acrid and blinding. Pews splintered as bullets tore through the wood. People screamed, scrambling for cover, diving to the floor in a panic of terror. Eli shoved Mara toward the cover of the front pew. "Stay down!" he yelled over the deafening roar. He returned fire, his movements economical and precise. He was no longer just a weary drifter. He was the man he had been a decade ago, a man forced to fight for his life, his senses sharp, his focus absolute. He fired again, and the second enforcer grunted and fell, his pistol clattering on the floorboards. But the exchange had cost him. He felt a white-hot, tearing pain in his left shoulder, and his arm went numb. He had been hit again. The wound in his side, stitched together so carefully by Mara, screamed in protest at his violent movements. A wave of dizziness washed over him, but he fought it back, gritting his teeth. Through the swirling smoke, he saw a flash of movement, a child. Henderson's young daughter, no more than 6 years old, had been separated from her father in the panic. She stood in the middle of the aisle, frozen in terror, crying silently, directly in the line of fire. At the same time, Cain, seeing his protectors fall, made a desperate move. He scrambled for the gun dropped by the second enforcer, his face a mask of insane fury. He was no longer a preacher, he was just a cornered animal. Eli saw it all in a split second. The child, the preacher grabbing for the gun. He did not think, he reacted. He lunged forward, shoving the little girl to the floor behind the relative safety of the pulpit, shielding her small body with his own. The preacher's shot, wild and panicked, caught Eli high in the back. The impact was a brutal, physical blow that drove the air from his lungs. It felt as if he had been kicked by a mule. The strength went out of his legs, and he sagged against the pulpit, his own gun slipping from his nerveless fingers. Cain stood over him, a triumphant, crazed look in his eyes. He raised the pistol again, ready to deliver the final, killing shot.
"Eli!"
Mara's scream was a sound of pure anguish. Cain turned, a cruel smile spreading across his lips as he saw her, unprotected, rising from behind the pew. He turned the gun from Eli toward her. "Now, witch!" he hissed. "You will kneel." But as he turned, he failed to see the subtle movement. He failed to see the fire that had replaced the fear in Mara's eyes. He failed to see the small, sharp knife that was suddenly in her hand. The knife Eli had used to make her shoes. The knife she had kept hidden in her sleeve. She did not hesitate. She did not wait for him to finish his threat. As he took a step toward her, she closed the distance between them with the speed of a striking snake. She drove the knife upward, under his ribs, with all the force of her anger, her grief, and her desperate will to live. Thaddeus Cain made a soft, surprised sound, a grunt of disbelief. He looked down at the handle of the knife protruding from his chest, and then up at Mara's face. He saw no fear, no submission. He saw only a cold, hard finality. The gun fell from his hand, and he collapsed to the floor. The reign of the false preacher of Grey Hollow ending not with a bang, but with a choked, final whisper. A profound, Ringing silence descended upon the chapel. The townsfolk slowly, hesitantly, rose from the floor, their faces a mixture of shock, fear, and a dawning, terrible understanding. They looked at the bodies of the enforcers, at the dead man on the floor before the altar, and at the woman who stood over him, a small, bloody knife in her hand. Into this silence stepped a new figure, a tall, broad-shouldered man with a weathered face and a silver star pinned to his vest appeared in the open doorway, flanked by 2 deputies. "Federal Marshal Davies," he announced, his voice a calm, authoritative bass that commanded the room. "I have a warrant for a man named Thaddeus Kane." His eyes swept the scene of carnage, taking in the bodies, the smoke-filled air, and Eli, who was now sliding down the side of the pulpit, leaving a dark smear of blood on the wood. The town had its justice. The law had finally arrived. But Mara did not see it. Her world had narrowed to the man who was collapsing before her eyes. She rushed to Eli's side as he crumpled to the floor.
Eli,
she whispered, her voice breaking. She cradled his head in her lap, her hands fluttering over his wounds, trying to stop the bleeding that was too profuse. That was coming from too many places. His eyes were glassy with pain and shock, his breathing shallow and ragged. His face was a deathly pale, beaded with sweat. The candlelight from the altar flickered across his features, making the shadows dance. "Mara," he breathed, his voice barely a whisper. He tried to lift a hand to her face, but it fell, limp, to his side. The marshal was beside them now, his voice gentle. "Ma'am, we need to get him to a doctor." But Mara did not hear him. She bent her head down, her dark hair falling around his face like a curtain, shutting out the rest of the world. She saw the life fading from his eyes, the light dimming. He had fought for her. He had taken bullets for her. He had given her back her life. And now he was losing his... She pressed her lips to his, a desperate, tender kiss. Tears she had not even realized she was crying fell onto his pale face. She pulled back, her forehead resting against his. "Don't you dare die," she whispered, her voice thick with love and terror. "Don't die before I say it." She took a shuddering breath, the words torn from the deepest part of her soul, a truth she had almost waited too long to speak. "I love you." His eyes flickered, a faint sign of recognition. A small ghost of a smile touched his lips, and then his eyes closed, and he went limp in her arms. The world returned to Eli Travers in fragments. First came the pain, a dull, thrumming beast with teeth in his shoulder, his back, and his side. Then came the muted sounds, a woman's low humming, the crackle of a fire, the distant bleating of sheep. For a long time, he floated in a gray twilight between a painful awareness and a dreamless dark. He remembered the chaos of the chapel, the face of a terrified child, the final, deafening report of Kane's pistol. He remembered falling, and he remembered Mara's face, her tears mingling with the blood on his own as she whispered words he was not sure he had heard correctly. When he finally opened his eyes and they were able to focus, he was in a clean bed with rough but comforting linen sheets. Sunlight, soft and hazy, streamed through a nearby window. The air smelled of sage and strong lye soap. He tried to sit up, but a fresh wave of agony shot through him, and he fell back against the pillows with a groan. "You'll be doing none of that," a familiar voice said. It was sharp, but not unkind. Mara came into his line of sight, wiping her hands on an apron. She looked different. Her hair was clean, tied back from her face. She wore a simple but sturdy calico dress that fit her properly. She was thinner, perhaps, but the hollow, haunted look in her eyes had been replaced by a weary but steady light. "You're a terrible patient," she informed him, a faint smirk playing on her lips. "You groan in your sleep like a dying bear." He managed a weak smile. "Good to see you, too." He was at Martha Stewart's ranch. He learned in bits and pieces over the next few days. What had happened? Marshall Davies and his men had taken control of Gray Hollow. The full extent of Cain's crimes, far worse than even Eli had imagined, had come to light. The town, shaken from its fearful slumber, was in the slow, painful process of healing. And Mara had stayed, not just for him, but for herself, after Eli had been stabilized by a traveling doctor the marshal had summoned. Martha, her earlier suspicions burned away by the fires of the confrontation she had witnessed, had insisted they stay at her ranch, her home, once a place of solitary survival, had slowly transformed. 3 other women, victims of Cain's reign in one way or another, had been found and had nowhere else to go. Martha, with a gruffness that barely concealed a deep well of compassion, took them in. The ranch became a haven, a place run by women who were rebuilding their lives from the ashes. And Mara, to everyone's surprise, including her own, had become its heart. She was a natural leader, her quiet strength and fierce practicality a bedrock for the others. She organized the work, tended to the livestock, and listened to their stories with an empathy born of shared suffering. She was no longer just a survivor. She was a creator, building a community where there had been none. She nursed Eli with a relentless, tender efficiency. She changed his bandages, spoon-fed him broth, and read to him from one of Martha's old, worn books when the nights were long and the pain kept him awake. But she never coddled him. She would tease him about his weakness, challenge him to sit up for a few minutes longer each day, and meet his frustration with a calm, unyielding resolve. She was loving him back to health, but she was doing it on her own terms, never losing the fire that was so essentially her. He was not her savior. They were partners, and for now, her role was to be the strong one, and he, for the first time in his life, let himself be cared for. He let himself be vulnerable, and he found that in her presence. It was not a weakness, but a kind of peace. As the weeks bled into a month, Eli's strength slowly returned. He was able to walk, first with a cane, and then without. He would sit on the porch and watch Mara work, a quiet pride swelling in his chest. He watched her gentle a spooked horse, her voice low and soothing. He watched her laugh with the other women, a genuine, unburdened sound that was more beautiful than any bird song. She was healing, too. The scars would always be there, for both of them, but they were no longer open, weeping wounds. The news from Gray Hollow was good. With Marshall Davies overseeing the transition, the town had elected a new council, with Henderson at its head. The fear that had hung over the streets like a shroud was gone, replaced by a tentative but determined hope. The chapel stood empty, a silent monument to a dark time, but the people were finding their faith again. Not in a building or a preacher, but in each other. A circuit judge had passed through and the legal matters were settled. Mara's actions were deemed self-defense, and the matter was closed. The town was free. One afternoon, Henderson's wife rode out to the ranch. She was a quiet, earnest woman who had once looked at Mara with fear. Now, she looked at her with a deep and profound respect. She came with a request from the women of Gray Hollow. They wanted Mara to speak to them. They wanted to hear her story, from her. Mara's first instinct was to refuse, to stand before them and bare her soul, to revisit the shame and the pain. It felt impossible. She spent the entire day in a restless silence, the old shadows creeping back into her eyes. That evening, Eli found her by the river that bordered Martha's property, skipping stones across the water's surface. "You don't have to do it," he said, standing beside her. She watched a flat stone skip 4 times before sinking. "I know," she said. "That's why I think I have to." She looked at him, her gaze clear and resolved. "For my whole life, other people have told my story for me. My uncle, the trapper, James, Cain. They all made me into what they wanted me to be. A piece of property, a sinner, a witch." She took a deep breath. "I think it's time I told the story myself." 2 days later, She stood before 24 women in the main room of Henderson's general store. The air was thick with anticipation. Eli stood at the back of the room, his presence a silent, steady anchor. Mara's hands were trembling, so she clasped them in front of her. She looked at the faces before her, some curious, some sympathetic, some still holding a flicker of the old judgment. She began to speak. Her voice, at first, was a shaking, uncertain thing. She did not speak of heroics or vengeance. She spoke honestly. She spoke of the fear, of the loneliness, of the crushing weight of the chains. She spoke of the lies she had told herself for years, that it was safer to be numb, to feel nothing. She told them how she had learned that survival was not just about breathing, but about fighting for the right to feel, to hope, to choose. Her voice grew stronger as she spoke, the words coming not from a place of shame, but from a place of hard-won truth. She was not asking for their pity or their forgiveness. She was offering them her truth, a testament that they were not defined by what had been done to them, but by how they chose to stand up afterward. When she finished, a profound silence filled the room. Then, one by one, other women began to speak. They told their own stories of loss, of fear, of the quiet ways Cain had terrorized them. In that room, surrounded by sacks of flour and barrels of nails, something new was forged, a community of survivors, no longer silent, no longer alone. Mara had not just reclaimed her own story, she had given them all permission to reclaim theirs. As they rode back to the ranch under a sky filled with the fiery colors of sunset, Eli was quiet for a long time. He looked over at Mara, her profile outlined against the brilliant light. She looked peaceful, a deep and settled calm in her eyes. That evening, as they sat on the porch, he knew the time had come. His wounds had scarred over. The future, which had been a blank, gray void for a decade, now seemed to hold a tentative promise of color. He turned to her, his heart, which he had thought long dead, beating a steady, nervous rhythm. "Mara," he began, his voice a little rough. "We have been through more than most folks see in a lifetime, and I know I am not much of a man when it comes to promises, but—" he fumbled for the words. This man of quiet action suddenly lost in a sea of feeling. "What I mean to say is, I think we ought to get married." She looked at him, and for a moment, he could not read her expression. Then, the slow, wry smile he had come to love spread across her face. She reached out and placed her hand on his.
Eli,
She said, her voice soft but laced with her unbreakable fire.
I already chose you.
He looked at her, confused.
What?
I chose you the night you undid my chains, she said, her eyes holding his. You did not come to own me or to claim me. You came to set me free. That was all the proposal I ever needed. He looked at her, at the incredible, fierce, loving woman beside him, and a slow grin spread across his face. Of course, it was so perfectly her. It was not a rejection, but the deepest affirmation he could imagine. It was better than a yes. It was a statement of fact, a truth that had been forged in darkness and brought into the light. They began building a home together the following spring. They chose a piece of land on the far edge of what had been Gray Hollow, a place where a meadow sloped gently down to the river. It was near the spot where he had pulled her from the raging water, the place where she had first let her guard down and slept beside his fire. They were transforming a memory of terror into a foundation for their future. They built it themselves, with help from Schmidt and some of the other townsfolk. Eli, his strength fully returned, felled the trees, his axe strokes ringing through the clear mountain air. Mara worked beside him, hauling the logs, her hands growing calloused and strong. They worked as they had survived, together. Their partnership was in every notched log, every stone laid for the hearth, every peg driven home. The final scene did not happen on a grand day. It happened on a quiet, ordinary night. The cabin was finished, the roof on, the windows in, It was not much more than a single room, but it was theirs, filled with the clean, sharp scent of new-cut pine. They had eaten a simple supper of rabbit stew and were sitting before the fire, the flames casting a warm, flickering glow across the room. Outside, the world was quiet, the only sound the gentle murmur of the nearby river and the chirping of crickets. Mara was staring into the fire, a thoughtful, distant look on her face. Eli came up behind her and wrapped his arms around her waist, pulling her back against his chest. He rested his chin on her shoulder, breathing in the scent of her hair. He felt a tremor run through her, a faint, involuntary shiver. It was the same kind of shiver he had felt when she was in the grip of a fever, the same tremor of a body that had known too much cold, too much fear. But this was different. He knew it instantly. It was not a shiver of the past. It was a tremble of the present, of a heart so full it threatened to spill over. She leaned back into him, her body relaxing into his embrace. The firelight danced in her eyes, turning them a deep, liquid blue. She whispered, her voice so low it was almost a thought.
I lied when I said I did not want to be saved.
It brought him back to that first day, to the proud, defiant woman in chains who had looked him in the eye and dared him to see her as human. He tightened his arms around her, holding her as if she were the most precious thing in the world, the anchor that had finally stopped his drifting. He pressed a soft kiss to her temple and replied, his voice a low, certain rumble against her ear. I know. Thank you for joining us on this journey through the trials and triumphs of the heart. Let us know where you are listening from in the comments so you can connect with fellow fans of the frontier. And please subscribe to the From Wild West channel to share your thoughts and be the first to hear our next tale.